I started the hike before sunrise, setting out alone on a trail deep in the wilderness. The air was crisp, the kind that chills your skin but feels good in your lungs. My pack was heavy on my shoulders, filled with everything I'd need for the next 2 days. Food, water, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and some emergency gear. I had triple-checked my supplies the night before. This wasn't my first solo hike, but it was my longest one yet. 30 miles through the mountains, over rocky ridges, past deep valleys, and into complete isolation. The first few miles felt great. The only sound was my boots crunching over the dirt and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The forest smelled of pine and damp earth, and the mist still clung to the lower parts of the trees. I moved at a steady pace, adjusting my pack every now and then to keep my shoulders from getting too sore. By mid-morning, I had covered nearly 10 miles. The sun was higher now, cutting through the trees in thick beams of light. I stopped for a break on a rocky outcrop overlooking a deep valley. I drank some water, ate a protein bar, and checked my map. Everything was going as planned. No signs of other hikers, no unexpected obstacles, just me and the trail. I took a deep breath and enjoyed the view before pushing forward. By the afternoon, the trail became more challenging. It narrowed, winding along the side of a steep incline. One misstep, and I'd go tumbling down a rocky slope. I stayed focused, placing my feet carefully, using my trekking pole to keep balance. Sweat trickled down my back, and my legs burned from the constant climb. Around 4 in the afternoon, I reached the point where I had planned to set up camp for the night. It was a flat clearing near a small creek, tucked between towering pines. I set down my pack, stretched out my legs, and started setting up my tent. The area was quiet, peaceful, except for the occasional birdsong and the babbling of the creek. I boiled some water for a dehydrated meal and ate in silence, watching the sky darken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air turned colder. I pulled on an extra layer and sat by my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. A distant coyote howled. Normal. Owls called to each other. Normal. Then I heard something else. A low, steady crunching in the leaves. Slow. Deliberate. My breath hitched. I turned my head toward the sound, my heart hammering. Probably a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon. But the steps were too heavy, too careful. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the trees in front of me. Nothing, just empty woods. The sound had stopped. I scanned the area for a minute, holding my breath. Still nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone in the wilderness. I shook it off, zipped myself into my tent, and forced myself to sleep. At some point during the night, I woke up. The forest was silent, completely silent. No wind, no insects, no distant animal calls. Just dead, suffocating quiet. I listened for a long time, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then there it was again, that slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Closer this time. I stayed perfectly still. The sound moved around the perimeter of my camp, circling. I reached for the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. My brain fought against itself, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but I couldn't find one. The steps paused, then started moving away, fading into the distance. I lay there, wide-eyed, heart racing, straining to hear anything else. After what felt like hours, I finally let myself breathe. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light filtered through the trees, I packed up camp as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't rest, just threw everything into my pack and started moving. I pushed hard, covering more ground than I planned. I didn't care about the ache in my legs or the sweat soaking my shirt. I just needed to get out of there. The feeling of being watched never left. By midday, I reached a high point on the trail where I had cell service. I pulled out my phone and checked for messages. Nothing urgent, but something made me pause. I had one missed call.
No voicemail.
The number was unfamiliar. I stared at it for a long time before putting my phone away. Just a wrong number. It had to be. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached a crossroads in the trail. One path led to my planned second night campsite. The other was a longer route but would get me back to my car before nightfall. I hesitated for only a second before taking the longer path. No way was I spending another night out here. The last stretch of the hike was brutal. My body screamed for rest, but I didn't stop. I only let myself breathe when I saw the small dirt lot where my car was parked. I practically jogged the last 100 yards, unlocking the door with shaky hands and throwing my pack into the back seat. As soon as I was inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main highway, that I let myself think about it. The footsteps, the circling, the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I was just paranoid. But then I remembered something. The dirt around my tent had been disturbed. I hadn't looked closely in my rush to leave, but now I could see it clearly in my mind. Shoe prints. Not boots like mine. Smaller, lighter. Someone had been out there, watching me, and I had never seen them. I had planned the hike for weeks, picking a remote trail deep in the mountains. The idea was to challenge myself, to disconnect from the world and push my limits. The trail was about 15 miles, looping through thick forest, over rocky ridges, and past a few small streams. It wasn't a popular trail, and that's what I wanted. Just me and the wilderness. I parked my truck at the lonely trailhead just after sunrise. The air was crisp, the sky clear. I tightened my pack straps, checked my GPS, and started walking. The first few miles were peaceful. The only sounds were my boots crunching over dirt and the distant calls of birds. Sunlight streamed through the trees, painting patterns on the ground. I felt strong, my legs steady, my mind clear. Around mile 5, the trail became rougher. The trees grew denser, the ground uneven. I climbed a steep ridge, my breathing deep and even. At the top, I paused to take a sip of water and admire the view. Rolling hills stretched for miles, the peaks of distant mountains breaking the horizon. No signs of civilization, just endless trees and rock. It was exactly what I wanted. Then, I noticed something odd. At the base of the ridge where I had just walked was a small clearing. In the center stood an old, rusted metal frame. A bed frame, maybe? It looked out of place, like something abandoned decades ago. I frowned, uneasy, but I shook it off. People left junk in the strangest places. I pushed forward. The next few miles were harder. The trail was less defined, overgrown in places. I had to watch my step carefully to avoid twisted roots and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the forest became. The trees were thicker now, their trunks twisted. Moss clung to everything. The air smelled damp, earthy, almost rotten. Every so often, I would hear the rustling of animals moving through the undergrowth, but I never saw anything. At mile 9, I stopped for lunch near a small stream. I sat on a fallen log, eating my sandwich in silence. The stream bubbled softly, but the forest itself felt off. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the occasional creak of a branch in the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the unease. After eating, I continued on. The trail narrowed, winding between massive boulders and through thick brush. My GPS showed I was still on course, but the path felt less traveled. Then, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Fresh ones. They weren't mine. The pattern was different. Someone had passed through here recently, but there was only one set, and they were deep. Whoever left them was carrying something heavy. I glanced around, suddenly feeling exposed. I hadn't seen a soul all day. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. I debated turning back, but I was over halfway. It made more sense to finish the loop. I pressed on, moving a little faster now, more aware of my surroundings. Every snapped twig made my pulse jump. The forest seemed darker, even though the sun was still high. At mile 11, I smelled something strange. It was faint at first, but the farther I walked, the stronger it got. A sharp, metallic scent mixed with something rotten. Blood. I slowed my steps, my heart beat loud in my ears. The smell was coming from up ahead, just off the trail. I swallowed hard and stepped carefully through the underbrush. Then I saw it. A deer, or what was left of it. His body was torn open, ribs jutting from flesh. The eyes were gone. The meat looked fresh, no decay, no scavengers yet. I scanned the area. No drag marks, no signs of a struggle. Whatever killed it did so cleanly. That's what scared me the most. Predator wouldn't leave a fresh kill untouched. It should have been feeding. I took a slow step back, then another. The hairs on my arms stood up. Something was out here, watching. I turned and walked quickly but carefully back to the trail, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Running would be stupid. It would make me look like prey. My mind raced through possibilities, cougar, maybe? But the kill didn't look like a cat's work. It was too precise, too intentional. The next mile was the longest of my life. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something moving in the trees. The forest was silent, the air thick with tension. Then, ahead of me, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The footprints. They were back, but now they were facing me. Someone had been walking ahead of me. Then they stopped, turned around, started walking back toward me. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I wasn't alone out here. Someone else was on this trail, tracking me. I pulled my knife from my belt and held it tightly. I needed to get back to my truck. Now, I picked up my pace, moving quickly but quietly. The trail twisted through thick brush, and I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. My mind raced through scenarios. Who was out here? Why were they following me? Were they the ones who killed the deer? Then I saw something up ahead that nearly made me stop. The bed frame. The same rusted frame I had seen hours ago at the bottom of the ridge. That wasn't possible. I had been hiking in one direction. There was no way I had looped back to the same spot. My hands went clammy. My breaths came fast. I pulled out my GPS and checked the map. I was still on the trail. According to the GPS, I was exactly where I should be. But I knew that was wrong. Something wasn't right. I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I gritted my teeth and kept moving. I had to keep moving. My truck was miles away, but I wasn't stopping now. My knife stayed in my hand, my pulse a drum in my ears. For the next 2 miles, I pushed forward without stopping. The trail felt different now. The trees pressed in, the light dimmer. My legs burned, but I didn't slow down. Then finally I saw it. The clearing, the trailhead, my truck. I nearly sprinted the last few hundred feet. When I reached my truck, I fumbled for my keys with shaking hands, yanked the door open, and locked it behind me. My breath came in gasps. My skin was slick with sweat. I turned the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Relief flooded me, but I didn't waste a second. I threw it into drive and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who or what was in that forest with me. I haven't been back to that trail. I don't plan to, and I never told anyone what happened. Until now. started my hike early in the morning, just after sunrise. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear, promising a perfect day for hiking. I had planned this trip for weeks, mapping out my route through a remote section of the national forest. The trail wasn't popular, which was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, fresh air, and a break from everything. I parked my truck at the small dirt lot near the trailhead. There were no other cars, just how I liked it. The first few miles were easy, winding through dense trees with occasional openings where the sun poured through. I kept a steady pace, listening to the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the dirt. About 5 miles in, the forest grew denser. The trees pressed in tighter, their branches casting long shadows even though the sun was still high. I noticed how quiet it was. No birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of my own footsteps and breathing. Felt off, but I brushed it aside. Sometimes forests got like this, silent for no real reason. I kept going, following the trail markers. After another mile, the path began to climb sharply. My legs burned, but it felt good. I welcomed the challenge. The higher I went, the rougher the terrain became. The dirt path turned into uneven rocks, some loose and shifting under my weight. I took my time, making sure each step was solid. A twisted ankle out here would be bad. At the top of the ridge, I paused to catch my breath and take in the view. The forest stretched for miles, unbroken except for a thin ribbon of a river far below. I took a long drink from my water bottle, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and checked my map. I was still on track. The next section would take me down into a valley where I planned to set up camp for the night. As I started my descent, I noticed the trail looked different from what I expected. It was narrower, more overgrown. I checked my map again. I should have been on the right path, but something felt off. Still, I continued. Trails changed over time, especially ones that weren't well-traveled. I walked for another hour, and that feeling of wrongness only grew. The trees here looked older, their trunks thick and gnarled. The silence was heavier. I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife. No deer tracks, no scurrying squirrels, not even insects buzzing. I stopped and listened. Nothing. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but there, pressed into the dirt beside the trail. My first thought was relief. Someone else had come through here. But as I looked closer, my stomach twisted. The prints weren't spaced like a normal stride. They were erratic, like whoever left them had been stumbling. Some prints were deeper than others, as if they had been dragging a foot. I followed them, my heart thudding harder now. They led off the trail into the trees. The logical part of me said to keep going, to stick to the path, but I hesitated. If someone had been injured, they might still be out here. I took a deep breath and stepped off the trail. The footprints led deeper into the woods. The ground was uneven, tangled with roots and rocks. I moved carefully, scanning ahead. The prints stopped near a cluster of boulders. I stepped closer, peering around them, and that's when I saw it. A backpack half covered in dirt and leaves. I crouched and pulled it free. The fabric was torn, the zippers broken. Inside, I found a water bottle empty, a jacket shredded, a phone, its screen cracked beyond use. No wallet, no ID, just those few things, abandoned like someone had left in a hurry. I stood up, scanning the area. No signs of a campfire, no other gear, just the backpack and the silence. I told myself it was old, that maybe a hiker had lost it seasons ago, but the footprints had been fresh. I looked around one last time before heading back to the trail. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping. Close. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The trees were thick, their shadows deep. I saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched crawled over me. Another snap, farther away this time. Then silence again. I walked faster, back toward the trail. My skin prickled. My breath felt too loud. I reached the path and forced myself to keep a steady pace. Don't run. Running made things worse. I didn't know why, but I felt it deep in my gut. I hiked another mile, barely paying attention to the trail markers, just moving, getting away from whatever had been back there. When I finally reached a clearing, I exhaled shakily. I checked my map again. I needed to reroute. Camping out here no longer felt safe. I decided to push through and hike back to my truck. It would be a long trek, but I'd rather be tired than stay out here overnight. I kept moving, not stopping for breaks. Every so often, I checked over my shoulder. Nothing, just trees, just silence. The sun started to dip, turning the sky orange. I was getting close to the parking lot, maybe another mile. My feet ached, my legs burned, but I kept going. Almost there, almost safe. Then I saw them. More footprints. These were right on the trail. The same erratic pattern. They hadn't been here earlier. I stopped, my chest tightening. The prints led in the same direction I was going, toward my truck. I forced myself forward. The lot came into view, my truck right where I left it. Relief crashed over me. I jogged the last stretch, keys already in my hand. As I reached the driver's side, I glanced at the dirt near my tires. Footprints, leading right up to my truck door. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and slammed it shut. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there, kicking up gravel. My hands were shaking. My whole body was tense. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if someone was standing there, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, civilization finally in sight. I still don't know what happened out there. I don't know who left those footprints or why they were at my truck. But I know one thing, I'll never hike that trail again. I parked my truck at the trailhead just before noon. The air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The forest around me stretched for miles, dense and endless. It was a solo trip, something I had planned for months. I wanted a challenge, something deeper than the short hikes I was used to. This was going to be 3 days in the backcountry, covering nearly 20 miles in a loop that would bring me back to my truck. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, feeling its weight settle in. Food, tent, sleeping bag, extra layers, everything checked out. The sky was overcast, but there was no rain in the forecast. I took one last look at the empty parking lot before stepping onto the trail. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail was well maintained, lined with ferns and thick underbrush. Birds called out from the trees, and every so often, a squirrel would dart across the path. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The distant hum of the highway had faded completely, replaced by the steady crunch of my boots on the dirt. By late afternoon, I had covered nearly 8 miles and found a decent place to set up camp. It was a small clearing just off the trail, bordered by towering fir trees. I set up my tent, unpacked my sleeping bag, and boiled water for a freeze-dried meal. As I ate, I noticed how still everything had become. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence that settled in as the sun dipped below the trees. I tried to ignore it. Being alone in the woods does strange things to the mind. I forced myself to focus on the simple tasks: cleaning up my cooking area, securing my food in a bear canister, and making sure my gear was organized for the night. By the time I crawled into my tent, darkness had fully settled in. I clicked off my headlamp and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come easy. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up with a start to the sound of something moving outside my tent. A slow, deliberate step. I held my breath, listening. Another step, this one closer. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced. A bear? A deer? Something bigger? I had food stored properly, so I doubted an animal would be drawn in. Then I heard it breathing. Slow, measured, human. My chest tightened. I waited, barely daring to move. The breathing was right outside my tent, heavy and low. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I strained my ears, listening, but all I heard was the ringing silence of the forest at night. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside, there were no footprints. Nothing seemed disturbed. It made no sense. I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe the wind through the trees, maybe my own breath echoing in my ears. I packed up quickly, eager to put distance between myself and that campsite. The trail wound deeper into the wilderness, the trees pressing in closer. I hiked fast, pushing myself harder than usual. I wanted to believe I was just being paranoid, but every so often I would stop and listen, and the feeling would return. That sense that something was just beyond my vision, watching. By late afternoon, I reached a river crossing. The bridge was nothing more than a few wooden planks stretched across the water, slick with moss. I stepped carefully, gripping a nearby branch for balance. Halfway across, I heard it again, movement in the trees behind me. I turned sharply, scanning the dense forest. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But my gut told me otherwise. I made camp that night near the river, choosing a spot with a wide view of my surroundings. As I set up my tent, I kept looking over my shoulder. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The night was worse than the one before. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps circling my tent. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, gripping my knife. The steps stopped, then something pressed against the fabric of my tent. A slow, dragging touch that moved from one side to the other. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to run, to tear out of the tent and sprint into the night, but where would I go? I was miles from civilization, alone, with no real plan other than to keep hiking. Then, just like the night before, it stopped. No retreating footsteps, no sound at all. Just silence. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed up and started hiking again. My body was exhausted, but adrenaline kept me going. Every now and then, I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, just beyond the trees. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing. By midday, I was close to the last stretch of the trail, a final 5 miles that would loop back to my truck. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, every muscle in my body urging me to move faster. Then I saw it. On the side of the trail, near a fallen log, was something that stopped me cold. My own boot prints, leading in the opposite direction. I had been walking in circles. Panic surged through me. I checked my GPS, my map. Everything said I was on the right path, but somehow I had ended up back where I started. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I taken a wrong turn? But I had been so careful, following every marker. Then I heard it again, footsteps. This time, they weren't slow. They were running. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't plan. I just ran. My pack slammed against my back with each step, my lungs burning. I didn't look behind me. I didn't want to see what was there. Branches scraped my face, my legs. I stumbled, caught myself, kept going. Then the parking lot. My truck was there, right where I had left it. I fumbled for my keys, threw my pack in the bed, and climbed in, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I looked up one last time, back toward the trail. The trees stood silent, unmoving, and then I drove, leaving whatever was out there behind. I don't know why I thought hiking alone was a good idea. I had done it plenty of times before, but something about this trail felt different. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like fingers. Or maybe it was the eerie silence, the kind that made my own footsteps sound too loud. But I had driven nearly 2 hours to get here, and I wasn't going to turn around just because of a weird feeling. Started out fine. The air was crisp, the sun high in the sky. I followed the narrow dirt path winding through thick forest, the kind where sunlight barely touched the ground. The smell of damp earth and pine filled the air. I was deep in the woods now, far from the road, far from any other hikers. That was the whole point. Peace and quiet. No traffic, no people, just me and nature. About an hour in, I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. A dead bird, right in the middle of the trail. Not just dead, mangled. Its wings were twisted, its head barely attached to its body. I stopped, staring at it, feeling a shiver crawl up my spine. Maybe a fox had gotten to it. Or a hawk. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I stepped around it and kept going. The further I went, the worse the trail got. The dirt turned to mud, and the trees grew even closer together. My GPS showed that I was still on the right path, but it felt like I was the first person to walk this way in years. Bushes grew wild, blocking parts of the trail. I had to push through them, the branches scratching at my arms. And the silence, it wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just my own breath, my own steps. Then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud. But they weren't normal footprints. They were barefoot, large, and the toes seemed too long. I stopped and stared at them, my heart pounding. Maybe someone else was out here, maybe they had lost their shoes. But something about them wasn't right. The way they sunk into the ground, like whoever left them was heavier than they should be. I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees felt like they were watching me. I kept moving faster now. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the footprints belonged to some hiker who preferred walking barefoot. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few minutes later, I smelled something awful, like rotting meat. It was strong, clinging to the air, making my stomach twist. I covered my nose and kept walking, but the smell didn't fade. If anything, it got worse. Then I saw it, something hanging from a tree up ahead. It was another animal, a deer this time, or what was left of one. It had been torn open, its insides spilling out, its legs dangling like some kind of sick decoration. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't natural. Predator wouldn't just leave a kill like this. Someone had done this. I turned around. I wasn't staying here any longer. But as I retraced my steps, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My own footprints, the ones I had left in the mud, were gone. The strange ones, the long-toed barefoot ones, were still there. But mine, erased, like I had never walked that way at all. I walked faster, almost running. The silence around me felt suffocating, pressing in on me like a heavy weight. I just needed to get back to my car. Just needed to get out of these woods. And then I heard it. A single, wet footstep behind me. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. I ran, branches whipping against my face, roots trying to trip me. My backpack slammed against my back with each step, but I didn't stop. I could hear breathing now, heavy and close, too close. The trees thinned, and I saw the parking lot ahead. My car. I dug into my pocket for my keys, not daring to look back. The second I reached the car, I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. My hands fumbled with the keys, shaking so bad I nearly dropped them. And then I finally looked up. Through the trees, just at the edge of the parking lot, something stood there. Not a person, not an animal, just something. The skin was too pale, stretched too tight. Its eyes black, empty. Its arms hung at its sides, long fingers twitching. And then it smiled. I didn't wait. I turned the key, slammed the car into reverse, and peeled out of there, tires kicking up gravel. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't hike alone anymore, and I sure as hell never go back to that trail. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me space to think, to be away from the noise of everyday life. There was something about being deep in the woods, just me and the sounds of nature, that felt right, peaceful. But that changed after my trip to Deep Hollow Trail. I had read about it in an old forum post, some guy raving about how remote it was, how you could hike for miles without seeing another soul. That sounded perfect. I wanted quiet. I wanted solitude. I wanted to push myself, see how far I could go. I set out early, driving for hours down increasingly empty roads until I reached the trailhead. There were no other cars. Good. I checked my gear, water, food, flashlight, map, compass, knife. I had my GPS, but I knew not to trust it too much in places like this. Some areas had no signal at all. The trail was narrow, cutting through thick trees. The forest felt untouched, ancient. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shifting shadows across the ground. It was perfect. For the first few hours, I walked steadily, enjoying the quiet. Around midday, I stopped for a break. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, checked my map. I had planned a loop that would take me deep into the forest before curving back toward the trailhead. It was supposed to be about 15 miles total long, but doable in a day. I wanted to push further, maybe camp overnight. I had packed for it just in case. I kept going deeper into the trees. The farther I got, the more the trail faded. It was still there, but less defined, overgrown in places. It felt like not many people had been this far in a long time. That was strange. Usually, even remote trails had some signs of use. But here, the only tracks were mine. By late afternoon, I had covered a lot of ground. I checked my GPS. No signal. That was expected. I pulled out my map again, tracing my route. According to it, I should have hit a small stream by now. But I hadn't seen any water. That was the first thing that felt off. I kept moving, hoping I had just miscalculated. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. The air felt different, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I ignored it and walked on. Then I noticed something else. No sounds. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just my own breathing and the crunch of my boots. That wasn't normal. Even in the most remote places, there were always some sounds. An animal moving, wind shifting the trees. But here there was nothing. Felt wrong. I tried to shake the feeling and focused on finding my way. I should have been looping back by now, but the trail was gone. Completely. I turned, trying to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. Thick trees, tangled undergrowth, uneven ground. I walked in what I thought was the right direction, but after an hour, I knew I was lost. Panic crept in, but I pushed it down. I had been in tough spots before. I still had supplies. I still had my map and compass. I wasn't in danger yet. I picked a direction and walked. The light was fading now, and I needed to find a place to camp before it got too dark. I didn't want to stumble around in the woods at night. I found a relatively clear spot near a fallen tree and set up my small tent. I built a fire, ate some food, tried to calm myself. Then I heard it, a crunch, a footstep, not mine. I froze, listening. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the fire settling or an animal. But I knew it wasn't. It had been deliberate. Close. I turned off my flashlight and sat in the dark, waiting. My knife was in my hand, just in case. My heart pounded in my ears. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. Morning came and I packed up quickly. I needed to find my way out. I checked my compass and started walking. Hours passed. The sun rose high, then started to dip again. I should have been out by now. I should have seen something, an old marker, a break in the trees, something. Then I saw the tree, a massive oak with a split trunk. I had passed it before. Hours ago, I had been walking in circles. That was when I really felt it, fear. Real fear, the kind that sinks deep in your gut. I forced myself to stay calm, to think. I climbed a nearby slope, trying to get a better view. Maybe I could spot a clearing, a road, something. I saw nothing but trees. Then I saw movement, a figure far off, half hidden between the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. My relief lasted only a second before dread took over. They weren't moving toward me. They weren't moving at all. They were standing there watching. I called out. No answer. I waved. Nothing. My gut screamed at me to go. I turned and started walking, faster now. I didn't look back. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every so often, I thought I saw something in the trees. A glimpse of movement, a shape that wasn't there when I looked again. The woods felt endless. The silence was crushing. Night fell again, and I had no choice but to stop. I didn't light a fire this time. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the dark, gripping my knife, every nerve on edge. Then the footsteps came again, closer this time, slow, deliberate. They stopped just beyond my sight. I held my breath, muscles locked. I didn't sleep. First light, I ran. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to move. I pushed through branches, tore through undergrowth. My legs burned. My lungs ached. Then finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I followed the road, not caring where it led, just knowing it was away from there. After an hour, I found an old ranger station. It looked abandoned, but there was a map inside. I traced my route with shaking fingers. I had wandered miles off course, miles into unmarked forest. I never saw the figure again. I don't know who or what they were. I don't want to know. I made it back to my car just as the sun was setting. I sat inside for a long time before I could bring myself to start the engine. I never went hiking alone again. I always loved hiking alone. It gave me a sense of peace, a break from the constant noise of everyday life. The wilderness was my escape, a place where I could clear my head and breathe. But after what happened last year, I haven't been able to step foot on a trail again. It was early October, the air crisp but not yet cold. I had planned a 2-day solo hike through a dense forest in northern Montana, a place I had read about online. It wasn't a popular trail, which was perfect for me. I wanted solitude, just me and the wilderness. I packed my bag carefully, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, knife, compass, a paper map, and a small first aid kit. I always made sure to be prepared. The first day was perfect. The trail wound through towering pines, the scent of damp earth filling the air. Birds called out in the distance, and I saw a few deer watching me cautiously before disappearing into the trees. I kept a steady pace, making good time. The plan was to reach a small clearing near a stream and set up camp before sunset. By late afternoon, I found the spot. It was beautiful, soft moss covering the ground, the gentle sound of running water nearby. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew quiet. I was used to this, the way the woods seemed to hold its breath at night. It never bothered me before. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself inside my sleeping bag, and listened to the distant hoot of an owl. Sleep came quickly. Something woke me in the middle of the night. A sound soft, deliberate. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon sniffing around my camp. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, careful steps moving through the trees just outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, but the only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the forest settling. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Nothing else happened. When morning came, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, scanning the area. Everything looked normal. My food was untouched, my gear exactly where I left it. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was just my imagination and packed up my things. The second day's hike was tougher. The trail grew steeper, the forest denser. I felt a strange sense of being watched, though I kept telling myself it was nothing. Probably just my nerves after last night. But as the day wore on, the feeling got stronger. The trees seemed to close in around me. The silence felt heavier. Then I saw it. A boot print. Fresh. Not mine. I stopped, my stomach tightening. There was no sign of other hikers. I hadn't passed anyone, and this wasn't a well-traveled trail. I crouched down, examining it. The print was deep, made by a heavy boot. Someone had been here recently, maybe just ahead of me. I stood up, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I picked up my pace, wanting to reach my next campsite before dark. I pushed through the last mile quickly, my muscles burning. When I finally reached the next clearing, I dropped my pack and took a deep breath. I needed to calm down. There was no reason to be afraid. People hiked all the time. Maybe it was just a hunter or another hiker who had taken a different route. I built my fire, ate my food, and forced myself to relax. But as night fell, the uneasiness returned. The forest was too quiet.
No crickets. No owls.
Just silence. Then the footsteps came again. Slow, measured, closer than before. I didn't move. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness. My knife was in my lap, my other hand gripping my flashlight. The steps stopped just beyond the trees. I pointed the flashlight into the woods, but the beam revealed nothing. I stayed like that for hours, my body tense. I didn't go into my tent. I didn't sleep. At some point, the footsteps retreated, but I knew someone had been there watching me. The first light, I packed up and left. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just walked, fast, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone following, but I saw nothing. The forest was empty. 3 miles from the trailhead, I found something that made my stomach drop. A piece of cloth. A torn scrap of dark fabric caught on a branch, just off the trail. And beneath it, another boot print. Deep, fresh. Someone had been following me. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just kept moving, my legs burning as I hiked faster than I ever had before. When I finally saw my car in the distance, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost collapsed. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, my hands shaking. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing, I wasn't alone in those woods, and I never will be again.